The room where Dean Martin spent his final days was not dramatic in the way people imagine death to be. There were no bright machines screaming warnings, no crowds, no whispered panic. There was only quiet, filtered sunlight touching the edge of a white curtain, the slow ticking of a clock that sounded louder than it should have, and the weight of a life that had carried too much grace to end in noise. Dean lay back against the pillows with the same composed stillness that had followed him through decades of stages and studios, his face thinner now, his voice softer, but his presence unchanged. Even weakened, he did not shrink. He occupied the room the way he always had, calmly, without effort, as if dignity itself had chosen him as its keeper. Ava Gardner sat nearby, her coat folded over the back of a chair, her hands resting together in her lap. Time had refined her beauty into something deeper than glamour, something etched by loss and wisdom. She had seen men fall apart when the lights went out. She had seen power rot into bitterness. Dean was different. He did not complain. He did not ask why. He observed the world with the same careful intelligence he always had, as though even now he were listening more than speaking. Ava had come because she knew what the world would never fully understand, that behind the relaxed smile and effortless charm was a man who had spent his life choosing restraint when he could have chosen cruelty, silence when he could have chosen revenge. As Dean rested, memories returned not as flashes, but as long, unbroken scenes, the way his life had always unfolded. He remembered the early days when the industry loved him, but never fully trusted him, when his Italian heritage was something whispered about in back offices, when doors opened only halfway. There had been meetings where executives smiled too politely, where jokes were made that pretended to be friendly but landed with sharp edges. He had learned early that humiliation in Hollywood rarely arrived shouting. It came disguised as opportunity, as laughter, as that's just how things are. And Dean, even then, had learned the power of not reacting. One night stood out among the many. It had been a charity gala in the late years of his fame, a room filled with polished smiles and expensive indifference. A young black pianist had been invited to play between speeches, his talent undeniable, his hands steady even as his shoulders carried visible tension. Dean had noticed it immediately. The boy played beautifully, pouring something raw and honest into a room that did not deserve it. When the music ended, the applause was brief, polite, and quickly replaced by conversation. Later, Dean overheard what no one had meant for him to hear, a sponsor complaining that the pianist didn't fit the tone of the evening, that perhaps next time they should choose someone more appropriate. Dean had not raised his voice. He had not made a scene. He had simply waited. When the organizer approached him later, nervously explaining that the pianist would not be invited back, Dean smiled gently and said, "Then neither will I, nothing more. No lecture, no anger." The room had gone quiet in a way money could not fix. By the next morning, the pianist's name was on the program for every future event. That had been Dean Martin's justice. Quiet, unavoidable. Those moments never made headlines. They did not fit the mythology people preferred. Dean Martin was supposed to be carefree, unserious, untouched by the moral weight of the world. The truth was heavier. He carried it privately, choosing when to speak and when silence would wound deeper. Ava had seen that side of him long before illness brought them together again. She remembered a studio dinner years earlier when an actress had been publicly belittled by a powerful producer, her reputation reduced to a punchline while everyone laughed to survive. Dean had waited until the laughter faded, then leaned forward and said calmly, "If you speak about her like that again, you won't speak to me at all." The producer had laughed it off, but he never crossed that line again. Now, as death approached, those choices seemed to gather in the room like unseen witnesses. Ava could feel it. The nurses felt it too, though none of them said it out loud. There was something about Dean Martin that demanded respect without asking for it. Even the doctor lowered his voice when he spoke to him. Even strangers seemed to move more carefully around his bed. Dean thanked everyone, always thanked them, always looked them in the eye. The injustice that haunted him most, though, was not one he had corrected. It was one he had watched unfold from a distance he could never quite close. Years earlier, a longtime crew member, a man who had worked silently behind the camera for decades, had been quietly dismissed when illness slowed him down. No farewell, no acknowledgement, just replaced as if loyalty had an expiration date. Dean had protested privately, had offered help, had made calls. The studio had smiled and assured him it would be handled. It never was. The man died not long after, his contributions erased by convenience. Dean had carried that failure with him, not as guilt, but as a reminder that even quiet authority had limits in a system designed to forget. That memory returned as Ava reached out and placed her hand over his. He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked, the way he always had, as if he were memorizing a face rather than glancing at it. "You stayed," he said softly, his voice worn but steady. "I always do," Ava replied, her voice catching despite her effort to control it. "You know that." He smiled faintly. Most people don't when the music stops. There was a pause, long enough for the clock to assert itself again. Outside, a car passed. Life continued with the indifference it always had. Ava leaned closer, sensing something unspoken pressing forward. She had spent her life around men who filled silence with ego. Dean let silence breathe. It was what made his words matter when they finally arrived. "I kept my mouth shut a lot," he said at last. "People thought it was laziness or charm. It was choice." Ava nodded. She knew. She had lived through enough storms to recognize restraint when she saw it. "There's a difference," Dean continued, "between being quiet because you're afraid and being quiet because you're certain." His breathing grew heavier, but his eyes remained sharp. "I wanted the world to remember the second." Tears slid down Ava's face without permission. She did not wipe them away. She knew better than to interrupt something earned. The doctor entered quietly, hesitating at the door as if unsure whether to disturb the moment. Dean looked toward him and gave a small nod, granting permission. The doctor spoke gently, explaining what Dean already understood. There was not much time. Comfort was the priority now. Dean listened without interruption, then thanked him. Again. After the doctor left, Ava leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there anything you want to say?" she asked. "Anything at all?" Dean closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, fixing his gaze somewhere beyond the room, beyond the hospital walls, perhaps beyond the industry that had both crowned and constrained him. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but every word carried weight. "Tell them," he said, "that I never needed to be loud to be right." He paused, gathering breath. "Tell them kindness is not weakness, and silence is only empty when there's nothing worth protecting." Ava broke then, her composure finally giving way. She pressed her forehead gently against his hand, her shoulders shaking. Dean watched her with the same calm attention he had given the world his entire life. He did not reach out. He did not try to fix her tears. He allowed them, honoring them as something real. In those final moments, the room grew impossibly still. The clock seemed to slow. Dean's breathing softened, then thinned, like a song fading rather than ending. Ava stayed exactly where she was, holding his hand until there was nothing left to hold but memory. When it was over, no announcement was made. No dramatic gesture marked the passing, only silence, the kind that carries meaning, the kind Dean Martin had mastered. Later, when the news spread, people spoke of his talent, his charm, his voice. They told stories they had always told. But those who had truly known him, who had felt the quiet correction of his words, the steady refusal to participate in cruelty, remembered something else. They remembered a man who changed rooms without raising his voice, a man who stood beside the vulnerable without needing applause, a man whose final words did not beg forgiveness or seek praise, but reaffirmed a life lived with deliberate grace. Ava would later say that being with Dean at the end did not feel like watching someone die. It felt like watching a standard being set one last time. And in that quiet hospital room, far from cameras and crowds, Dean Martin did what he had always done. He restored dignity. He left silence behind him. And in that silence, the world finally understood how loud he had been all along. The weeks after Dean Martin's passing did not unfold with the peace people expected. Hollywood had learned how to mourn publicly, but it had never learned how to sit honestly with what it had done, or failed to do, while a man like Dean was still alive. Tributes arrived polished and rehearsed, full of warm adjectives that avoided uncomfortable truths. Ava Gardner watched it all from a distance, the way one watches a familiar illusion finally admit itself. She knew Dean would have smiled at the speeches, perhaps even laughed softly at the exaggerations, but she also knew what was missing. No one spoke about the moments when he had chosen decency over advantage, when he had stood still while others scrambled to preserve power. Those stories remained unclaimed because they did not flatter institutions. They revealed them. Ava returned to Lowe's Angels not for ceremony, but for unfinished gravity. Dean's quiet authority had not ended with his breath. It lingered in rooms where decisions were still being made, in contracts still unsigned, in reputations still protected by silence. She felt it most clearly when she was invited, unexpectedly, to a private gathering at an old studio lot, a place Dean had worked for decades. Officially, it was a remembrance. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. The same executives who had once leaned on Dean's reliability without ever fully respecting his restraint were there, their voices careful, their laughter thin. Ava recognized the tone immediately. This was not grief. This was control trying to reassert itself. As she moved through the room, she overheard fragments that tightened her chest. A young singer's name mentioned dismissively, a joke about keeping things traditional, a quiet agreement that certain stories were better left untouched now that Dean was gone. It was the same injustice, wearing a different suit. Ava felt anger rise, sharp and immediate, but she also felt something else, steadier and heavier. She remembered Dean's words. Silence is only empty when there's nothing worth protecting. He was no longer here to stand in these rooms, but his absence did not remove responsibility. It transferred it. The turning point came when a producer began speaking openly about a planned biographical project, one that would smooth away anything complicated, anything uncomfortable. Dean Martin as a charming myth. No questions asked, no resistance remembered. Ava listened without interrupting, her expression calm, almost unreadable. When the producer finished, expecting agreement, she spoke, her voice low but unwavering. She did not raise it. She did not accuse. She simply said, Dean would never have allowed that version of himself to stand alone. The room shifted. Eyes turned toward her. She continued, choosing each word with the same precision Dean once had. If you tell his story without the moments where he chose dignity over silence, you are not honoring him. You are erasing him. There was a pause, thick and uncomfortable. Someone tried to laugh it off, suggesting audiences preferred simplicity. Ava met his eyes and replied, Dean Martin never lived simply so others could feel comfortable. That was all. No threats, no dramatics, just truth placed carefully on the table. The producer's confidence faltered. The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. The illusion had cracked. What Ava had done was not confrontational by Hollywood standards, but it was devastating in its clarity. It echoed Dean's way. One sentence, one line drawn, no violence, no spectacle, just consequence. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. People began to speak differently when Dean's name came up. Crew members shared stories quietly, almost cautiously at first, about moments when he had intervened without demanding credit. Musicians remembered how he insisted they be paid fairly. Women remembered how he had shut down humiliating conversations without humiliating anyone in return. These accounts did not come from press releases. They came from memory, released as though permission had finally been granted. Ava listened, realizing that Dean's final act had not been dying with dignity. It had been leaving behind a standard that others were now forced to measure themselves against. One evening, alone in a hotel room, Ava replayed her last conversation with him. His words had not destroyed him, as the headlines suggested. They had stripped away the comfort of pretending. They had destroyed the lie that kindness was passive, that silence meant surrender. Dean Martin's life, seen clearly now, revealed something Hollywood rarely admitted, that real authority did not dominate, it corrected. It did not shout, it remained. And once seen, it could not be unseen. By the end of that season, the studio project changed direction. Names were added, scenes rewritten, not to sensationalize but to acknowledge. The injustice was not dramatized, but it was no longer hidden. Ava attended no premieres. She did not need to. She had done what Dean would have done. She had spoken once clearly and allowed silence to do the rest. In that silence, respect returned. Not loudly, not perfectly, but enough to matter. And somewhere between the unfinished stories and the newly spoken truths, Dean Martin's presence remained, quietly powerful, unchanged, proving that even in absence, dignity can still stand its ground. Time did what it always does after a great loss. It moved forward without asking permission, carrying people back into routines they pretended had not been altered. Yet beneath the surface of Hollywood's polished return to normal, something had shifted. Ava Gardner felt it in the way conversations paused when Dean Martin's name was spoken, not out of reverence alone, but out of caution. His quiet moral weight had begun to unsettle people who had long survived on noise and distraction. For the first time in years, Certain rooms felt less secure in their certainty, and that unease was not accidental. It was the echo of a man who had refused to be owned by the systems that profited from him. Ava received a letter one afternoon, handwritten, the paper slightly creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times before being sent. It was from the daughter of the crew member Dean had never been able to fully protect, the man whose quiet dismissal had followed him into his final years like an unresolved chord. The woman wrote without bitterness, her words careful and restrained. She explained that she had found comfort in hearing stories about Dean after his death, that she had never known how hard he had tried or how much it had mattered. At the end of the letter, she thanked Ava not for her public defense, but for allowing the truth to surface without turning it into spectacle. Ava read the letter twice, then sat in silence, understanding that this, more than any tribute, was the real measure of justice. The injustice Dean had carried was not isolated. It was part of a pattern Hollywood had perfected. Use people until they are inconvenient, then forget them with professional efficiency. What made Dean dangerous to that pattern was not rebellion, but memory. He remembered names. He remembered faces. He remembered who had been present when no one was watching. Ava realized now that his restraint had not been passive endurance, but strategic patience. He had known when his voice would matter most, and when silence would wound deeper than confrontation. That knowledge was what frightened people now, even in his absence. The turning point of this next chapter did not come from Ava, but from an unexpected source. A young director, newly given power and still uncertain how to hold it, requested access to Dean's private correspondence for a serious biographical study. The studio hesitated, fearing exposure more than inaccuracy. Ava was asked, indirectly, to discourage the effort. She listened, as she always did, then declined to interfere. "If you're afraid of what's written," she said calmly, "then you already know it deserves to be read." That single sentence changed the trajectory of the project. The director was granted limited access, enough to see what others had hoped would remain buried. What he found was not scandal. It was worse for those who feared accountability. It was clarity. Letters where Dean declined opportunities rather than compromise colleagues. Notes where he refused to endorse projects that humiliated people for profit. Quiet interventions written without ego, without flourish, without any expectation of recognition. The injustice was no longer abstract. It had names, dates, and decisions. The director did not sensationalize them. He did not need to. The restraint spoke for itself. As these truths began to circulate privately, reactions followed predictable lines. Some praised Dean publicly, reframing his restraint as wisdom. Others dismissed it as nostalgia, insisting the industry had moved on. But there were those who felt exposed. Meetings were delayed. Scripts were rewritten. Certain names quietly disappeared from leadership roles, not through scandal, but through loss of trust. No one announced these changes. They simply happened, the way corrections often do when they are long overdue. Ava watched this unfold with a strange calm. She did not celebrate. Dean would have disliked that. He had never sought victory over others, only alignment with himself. One evening, standing alone on a balcony overlooking the city, she spoke aloud for the first time since his death, not to anyone in particular, but to the memory that still accompanied her. "You knew," she said softly. "You knew this would take time." The wind carried her words away, but the understanding remained. The emotional weight of it all settled most heavily on those who had once mistaken Dean's kindness for compliance. They began to realize that his silence had not protected them. It had protected the vulnerable. And now, without his presence to absorb the tension, the consequences landed elsewhere. The injustice he had named without naming was finally being addressed, not through outrage, but through adjustment, through correction, through the slow, uncomfortable process of dignity being restored where it had been denied. By the end of that year, Dean Martin's legacy no longer fit neatly into the myth that had once defined him. He was still charming, still beloved, but now he was also understood. Ava felt the shift deeply. His final words had not destroyed him. They had destroyed the comfort of forgetting, and in its place they had left something far more difficult and far more necessary: memory. By the time the city moved into another awards season, the air around Hollywood felt heavier, as if the past had finally caught up and refused to be dismissed as nostalgia. Dean Martin's name no longer floated through conversations as a pleasant symbol of another era. It carried weight now, the kind that demanded care. Ava Gardner sensed it the moment she was invited to a closed-door panel on legacy and responsibility, a title polished enough to sound harmless. She almost declined. Dean would have avoided stages designed for display, but she understood that absence could also become permission, and this was not a room she was willing to surrender. The panel took place in an old theatre, its velvet seats faded, its chandeliers dimmed by decades of dust and ambition. Executives, performers, and press filled the space with practiced attentiveness. Ava sat quietly as others spoke first, offering thoughtful but cautious reflections on changing times and learning from the past. The words flowed easily, too easily. When Ava was finally asked to speak, the room leaned forward, expecting either nostalgia or provocation. She offered neither. Instead, she told a story, not long, not dramatic. She described a night years earlier when Dean had walked out of a private dinner after a racist joke was made about a musician who wasn't there to defend himself. He didn't lecture, she said. He didn't threaten. He stood up, nodded once, and left. She paused, letting the image settle. The joke was never told again. The injustice was clear, but Ava did not frame it as outrage. She framed it as correction. She spoke of how power responds not to shouting, but to certainty. How Dean had understood that walking away could sometimes be louder than staying. The silence in the theatre grew thick, uncomfortable for those who preferred performance to accountability. Someone later tried to soften the moment, suggesting that such actions were easier for stars of Dean's stature. Ava turned toward him calmly. "It is always easier to do nothing," she replied. "Status only decides who notices." That sentence became the turning point of the evening. It was quoted carefully, without embellishment, and circulated quietly among those who understood its implication. The panel ended without applause. No one seemed to know whether it was appropriate. Ava considered that a success. Dean had never trusted applause to mean understanding. After that night, resistance emerged more openly. A senior figure, long shielded by reputation, dismissed Dean's restraint as selective morality, suggesting privately that silence could be weaponized as easily as words. The implication was clear. If Dean had truly cared, he would have fought louder. Ava was told of these remarks second-hand. She did not respond immediately. She waited, the way Dean always had, until response was necessary. It came when the same figure attempted to block funding for a young black filmmaker whose work confronted historical injustice without anger or spectacle. The excuse was market risk. Ava requested a meeting, one-on-one. When it finally happened, she listened patiently as the man spoke at length about audience expectations and brand safety. When he finished, Ava said only, Dean Martin would have funded this without asking who would be offended. The man smiled dismissively, then stopped when he realized she was not smiling back. She leaned in slightly, her voice still even. And if you stop it, she added, everyone will know you are afraid of a story, not protecting an audience. That was all, no threat, no raised voice. Within weeks, the funding was restored, quietly rerouted through channels designed to avoid attention. The film moved forward. The man retained his position, but something fundamental shifted. He had been seen, not publicly shamed, but privately understood. Dean's method again. Correct, don't crush. Ava felt the emotional cost of these moments more than she expected. Each intervention reopened grief, reminding her that Dean should have been the one in these rooms, steady and unyielding in his calm. Yet she also felt something else, something like resolve. Carrying his standard did not mean becoming him. It meant remembering why his presence had mattered. Late one night, alone, Ava replayed a memory she had not allowed herself to touch. Dean, years earlier, after an argument neither of them could fully articulate, had said, "People confuse peace with surrender." At the time, she had not understood the depth of it. Now she did. Peace for Dean had always been active, chosen, defended. By the end of that season, the narrative around Dean Martin had changed irrevocably. Not because he was praised more loudly, but because the spaces he had once corrected were correcting themselves. Slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Ava watched it all with quiet attention, aware that justice rarely announces itself when it arrives. It simply leaves fewer places to hide. And in that narrowing space, Dean Martin's legacy continued its work, proving that even in a world built on spectacle, restraint could still move mountains. The closer Hollywood came to acknowledging its reflection, the more it tried to look away. That resistance did not arrive as open hostility. It came wrapped in concern, in warnings about division and fatigue, in the familiar suggestion that the past should be allowed to rest. Ava Gardner recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen it her entire life. When injustice becomes inconvenient, it is often rebranded as exhaustion. Dean Martin had anticipated this long before his final days. He had understood that the hardest moment for truth was not confrontation, but endurance. Ava began to notice the subtler consequences of the shifts Dean's legacy had triggered. Invitations grew selective. Certain doors opened more slowly. She was no longer avoided, but she was no longer indulged either. Power was recalibrating, testing how far this quiet correction would be allowed to go. One afternoon, she was invited to a luncheon with several influential figures, framed as an informal discussion about preserving unity in the industry. The language alone signaled danger. Unity, when demanded from above, often meant silence from below. The luncheon took place in a private home perched above the city, the view breathtaking enough to distract from the tension inside. The conversation remained polite, circling around Dean's name without touching it directly, until one executive finally spoke what the others had been waiting to hear. "We all respected Dean," he said, his tone measured. But there's a concern that his image is being used now to reopen wounds that were already healing. Ava listened without reacting, the way Dean had taught her without ever meaning to. When it was her turn, she set her glass down gently and replied, "Wounds that are covered are not healed. They're hidden." The room fell quiet. She continued, not pressing, not accusing. Dean didn't reopen wounds, she said. He refused to pretend they weren't there. Someone else suggested that constant correction risked damaging legacies, including Dean's own. Ava met that fear directly. If a legacy can't survive honesty, she said, it was already broken. No one argued. They couldn't. The truth had landed cleanly without force. The emotional turning point of this chapter came days later, when Ava was asked to attend a private screening of the young filmmaker's project that had nearly been silenced. The room was small. No press. No announcements. As the film unfolded, it did not accuse or provoke. It simply showed people as they were, dignified even in suffering, restrained even in resistance. Ava felt tears gather, not because the story was tragic, but because it was allowed to exist at all. She thought of Dean then, of how he had always insisted that people be seen whole, not simplified for comfort. After the screening, the filmmaker approached her, nervous but composed. He thanked her, then hesitated, unsure whether to say what clearly needed to be said. Ava spared him the discomfort. "You didn't owe anyone anger," she said gently. "You owed them truth." The young man nodded, relief and gratitude crossing his face. In that moment, Ava felt something settle inside her. This was the reason Dean's restraint mattered. It created space. It allowed others to stand without becoming what they opposed. The backlash, when it came, was quieter than expected. A few opinion pieces questioned whether Dean's influence was being romanticized. Others warned against moral revisionism. Ava read none of them. Dean would have ignored them. He had never mistaken criticism for consequence. What mattered was what changed when the noise faded. And things were changing. Hiring practices adjusted. Conversations shifted. People paused before dismissing voices that had once been convenient to ignore. One evening, walking alone through her garden, Ava realized she no longer felt the same urgency she had in the months after Dean's death. The work was no longer hers alone. Others had begun to carry it, not as a crusade, but as a standard. That was Dean's final gift. He had shown that justice did not need fury to endure. It needed consistency. As the season turned, Ava understood that the industry's discomfort was not a sign of failure, but of progress. Comfort had always been the enemy of correction. Dean Martin's legacy was doing exactly what he would have wanted. It was making people choose, quietly and repeatedly, between convenience and dignity. And for the first time since his passing, Ava allowed herself to believe that the silence he left behind was not an ending. It was a beginning, still unfolding. The final shift came without announcement, the way true change often does. There was no headline declaring that Hollywood had learned its lesson, no ceremony marking the end of old habits. Instead, there was a gradual thinning of cruelty, a subtle retreat of arrogance, a noticeable pause before decisions that once would have been made without thought. Ava Gardner felt it most clearly not in grand rooms, but in small ones, where assistants spoke with more confidence, where young performers were listened to instead of managed, where silence no longer automatically favored the powerful. Dean Martin's presence lingered there, invisible but unmistakable. Ava's last public appearance connected to Dean happened almost by accident. A modest cultural foundation announced a scholarship in his name, focused on artists whose work centered dignity, restraint, and moral clarity rather than spectacle. Ava attended the private dedication, expecting little more than polite words. What she found instead stopped her. One by one, people stood to speak, not about Dean's fame, but about moments when his quiet choices had altered their lives. A sound engineer described how Dean had insisted he be credited properly after years of being overlooked. A singer recalled how Dean refused to perform unless the band was paid equally. None of these stories were dramatic. That was the point. They were precise. They were human. They revealed a pattern no myth could erase. As Ava listened, she understood something that eased the last tight place in her chest. Dean's final words had not destroyed him. They had destroyed the lie that goodness required permission. He had never waited for approval to act decently. He had simply done it, again and again, until it became unmistakable who he was. That truth now lived outside him, carried forward by people who had once believed they were alone. The injustice that had haunted his final years did not vanish completely. Ava knew better than to expect perfection, but it no longer thrived unchecked. It no longer hid comfortably behind laughter or tradition. Dean's method had proven enduring. He had not fought the system head-on. He had outlasted its worst instincts. In doing so, he had exposed them. On the anniversary of his passing, Ava visited the quiet place where he rested. There were no crowds, no flowers arranged for cameras. She stood alone, the air still, the world continuing at its indifferent pace. She spoke softly, not out of grief, but out of recognition. "You were right," she said. "Silence remembers." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled. As she turned to leave, Ava felt no sense of unfinished business. Dean Martin's story was complete, not because every wrong had been corrected, but because he had never betrayed himself. He had lived as he died, composed, intelligent, respectful, quietly powerful. He had shown that justice could be delivered without spectacle, that authority could exist without dominance, that dignity could survive even the most indifferent systems. Hollywood would continue to change, and to resist change, as it always had. But it would never again be able to pretend that restraint was weakness. Dean had ended that illusion with a life lived deliberately and words spoken only when they mattered most. In the end, his greatest act was not standing in the spotlight, but stepping just far enough out of it to let others be seen. And that was why Ava Gardner stayed with him until the end. Not because he needed saving, but because he had shown her, and everyone else, how to stand quietly in the face of injustice and still be unmovable. Dean Martin did not leave behind noise. He left behind a standard. And once a standard exists, the world can never return to pretending it didn't know better.